On a cold February morning in 1993, in the high desert country of New Mexico, a woman named Girly Hossencofft walked out of her apartment and into a mystery that would haunt a community for years. She left behind a half-drunk cup of coffee on the kitchen counter, her purse on the dining room table, and her 9-year-old son asleep in his bedroom. The door to her apartment stood slightly ajar, though she always locked it. A neighbor would later say she heard raised voices around 2 in the morning, then silence. By dawn, Girly Hossencofft was gone. No body, no witnesses, no trace, but in a place where everyone knows everyone, where secrets have nowhere to hide under the vast New Mexico sky, someone knew what happened that night. The question was simple, terrible, and would take years to answer. Who took Girly Hossencofft, and why did it take so long for anyone to tell the truth? Albuquerque in 1993 sat like a sprawling oasis against the Sandia Mountains, a city caught between the romance of Route 66 and the harsh reality of high desert poverty. The wind came down from the mountains carrying the scent of piñon and dust, sweeping through neighborhoods where adobe houses stood beside trailer parks, where university professors lived 3 blocks from families working 2 jobs to survive. Girly Hossencofft lived in one of these in-between places, a modest apartment complex on the western edge of the city, where the buildings were painted in fading pastels and children's bicycles lay scattered in the courtyards. She was 36 years old, a petite woman who stood barely 5 feet tall, with dark hair and a quiet manner that made her seem smaller than she was. Born in Malaysia, she had come to America for the promise it held, had married, had a son, and now found herself navigating the complicated waters of divorce. Her estranged husband was a man named Hossencofft, though those who knew him said he went by many names. Some called him Armand, others knew him as Dion. He claimed at various times to be a doctor, a geneticist, a researcher working on classified government projects involving alien DNA. He wore his eccentricity like armor, speaking in technical jargon, carrying himself with an air of mystery that some found fascinating and others found profoundly unsettling. They had been separated for over a year. Their marriage dissolved into a bitter custody battle over their son, Jevon. Girly had moved out, found her own place, built a life that was hers alone. She worked at the Sandia National Laboratories in a clerical position, kept to herself, focused on giving her son stability in the aftermath of an unstable marriage. February 9, 1993 began like any other Tuesday. The morning sun rose cold and bright over the Sandias, casting long shadows across the city. Girly woke early, as she always did, made coffee in the small kitchen of her apartment, got her son ready for school. The apartment was neat, spare, decorated with the careful attention of someone who had started over. A few photographs on the mantel, books stacked on the coffee table. The television set in the corner turned off. She drove Jevon to school that morning in her white Acura, made sure he had his lunch money, watched him walk through the school doors before pulling back into traffic. Her coworkers at Sandia would later say she seemed normal that day. Quiet as always, but not troubled. She ate lunch at her desk. She filed paperwork. She answered phones. At 5:15 in the afternoon, she gathered her purse and her coat and drove home through the evening traffic as the sun descended toward the western mesa. She picked up Jevon from the after-school program at 6. They stopped at a Fur's cafeteria for dinner, sat in a booth by the window, ate meatloaf and mashed potatoes while Jevon told her about his day. Other diners would remember seeing them there, the small woman and the boy, nothing unusual, nothing that would stick in the memory except in retrospect, when every detail would matter. They returned home around 7:30. Jevon would later recall that his mother helped him with his homework at the kitchen table, that they watched television together for a while, that everything was normal. She tucked him into bed around 9 o'clock. He fell asleep to the sound of the television murmuring in the living room, the familiar sounds of home, safe and ordinary. What happened next came in fragments, pieces of a puzzle that didn't fit together until much later. A neighbor in the adjacent apartment, a woman named Rosa Martinez, told police she heard voices coming through the shared wall sometime after midnight. A man's voice, low and insistent. A woman's voice, higher, frightened. She couldn't make out the words, just the tone, the urgency. Then a sound like furniture being moved, something heavy dragged across the floor. Then silence. She almost got up to check, she said later, but it was late and she was tired and she told herself it was probably nothing, probably just a television program turned up too loud. She rolled over and went back to sleep. That hesitation, that single moment of uncertainty, would haunt her for years. At 7:30 the next morning, Jevan woke up alone. His mother's bedroom door stood open, the bed made or perhaps never slept in. He called for her. No answer. He walked through the apartment, his 9-year-old mind not yet understanding that something was wrong, just feeling the wrongness in the air, the way a house feels when it's empty in a way it shouldn't be. Her coffee cup sat on the counter, still half full, gone cold. Her purse lay on the dining room table, her keys beside it, her wallet inside with her driver's license and credit cards intact. The front door was unlocked, something his mother never allowed. He opened it, looked out into the courtyard, saw the morning light slanting across the empty parking spaces, the cottonwood trees beginning to bud with early spring. Her car was gone. He stood there for a long moment, a child alone in the terrible space between not knowing and knowing, before walking back inside to call the school, to tell them his mother hadn't woken him up, that something was wrong. The Albuquerque Police Department received the call at 8:45 that morning. A missing person report, routine at first, filed with all the usual details. Name, age, physical description, last seen wearing unknown clothing, driving a white 1989 Acura with New Mexico plates. But even in those first hours, certain things didn't sit right with the responding officers. The purse left behind, the keys, the unlocked door. The fact that Girly Hossencofft was, by all accounts, a woman of strict routine, someone who did not deviate from her patterns, who would never leave her son alone. Detective Samuel Martinez, a 20-year veteran of the department, took the case. He arrived at the apartment that afternoon, walked through the rooms with careful attention, noted everything that was there and everything that wasn't. No signs of struggle, no blood, no broken furniture or shattered glass. Just an absence, a woman-shaped hole in the fabric of an ordinary day. The search began immediately. Patrol officers canvassed the neighborhood, knocked on doors, asked neighbors if they had seen or heard anything unusual. Most hadn't. A few remembered the white Acura leaving around 2 in the morning, but no one had seen who was driving. The headlights had swept across bedroom windows, briefly illuminating curtains before disappearing down the street. The car was found 3 days later in a parking lot near the Albuquerque International Sunport, doors unlocked, keys in the ignition. Inside, investigators found nothing unusual. No blood, no evidence of violence, just a clean car, abandoned as if its owner had simply decided to walk away. Those who knew Girly said that was impossible. Her family in Malaysia, reached by phone, said she would never leave her son, never abandon him without explanation. Her coworkers at Sandia said the same thing. She was dedicated to that boy, they said, fiercely protective, the kind of mother who put her child's needs above everything else. If she was gone, it wasn't by choice. The focus turned, as it often does in such cases, to the husband. Ex-husband, technically, though the divorce wasn't yet final. Diazine Hossencofft lived in an old house on the outskirts of the city, a rambling structure with peeling paint and windows covered with aluminum foil. supposedly to block electromagnetic radiation from government surveillance. He told anyone who would listen that he was being monitored, that his work was too important, too dangerous, that forces beyond human understanding were interested in his research. Detective Martinez interviewed him on February 14th, 5 days after Girly disappeared. The transcript of that interview would later be entered into evidence, read aloud in a courtroom years later, every word weighted with implications. Hossencofft sat across the table in the interview room, calm, almost relaxed. He expressed concern about his ex-wife's disappearance, said it was troubling, said he hoped she was safe. But his body language told a different story. He leaned back in his chair. He smiled occasionally. He spoke about Girly in the past tense, a slip that Detective Martinez noted carefully in his report. When asked about his whereabouts on the night of February 9th, Hossencofft said he had been home alone, working on his research. No alibi, no witnesses, just his word. Volunteers from the community organized search parties. They combed the desert east of the city, walking in lines through the scrub and chamisa, looking for any sign of Girly Hossencofft. They searched the bosque along the Rio Grande, that tangle of cottonwoods and Russian olives where the river ran shallow and cold. They found nothing. Days turned into weeks. The local news stations ran stories about the missing woman, showed her photograph, asked anyone with information to come forward. Tips came in, dozens of them, all leading nowhere. Someone thought they saw her at a gas station in Santa Fe. Someone else claimed she had run away to California to start a new life. Every lead evaporated under scrutiny. The investigation began to slow, resources diverted to newer cases, fresher trails. By March, the search parties had disbanded. By April, the news stations had moved on to other stories. Girly Hossencofft had become another name in a file, another cold case gathering dust. But Detective Martinez couldn't let it go. Something about the ex-husband bothered him, something beyond the obvious strangeness. It was the composure, the way Hossencofft seemed almost pleased by the attention, as if the investigation were a game he was winning. Deputies whispered quietly among themselves that Hossencofft had done something, that he knew where Girly was, but without evidence, without a body, there was nothing they could do. The law required proof, and proof was the one thing they didn't have. The case went cold in the summer of 1993, filed away in a cabinet in the basement of the police department, another mystery in a city full of them. Clears throat. Time has a way of changing things that seem fixed. The sharp edges of grief soften. The urgent questions fade into a dull ache that people learn to carry. For young Jevon Hossencofft, life went on in the way life does for children who have no choice but to move forward. He went to live with his father in that strange house on the outskirts of the city, the house with the covered windows and the rooms full of equipment that hummed and blinked with unknown purposes. Diazian Hossencofft told his son that his mother had gone away, that she had her reasons, that someday he might understand. The boy asked questions at first. Where did she go? When is she coming back? Why didn't she say goodbye? But his father's answers were vague, unsatisfying, and eventually the boy stopped asking. He learned to live with the absence, the not knowing, the way one learns to live with a missing limb. The years passed slowly in that house. Neighbors rarely saw the boy. He was homeschooled, his father said, educated in advanced subjects that regular schools couldn't provide. A social worker visited once, asked Jevon if he felt safe, if he had enough to eat, if his father treated him well. The boy nodded. He was polite, quiet, gave no indication of abuse or neglect. The social worker left satisfied, filed a report indicating no concerns. But those who glimpsed Jevon during this time, the grocery store clerks, the librarians, the rare visitors to the house, said there was something haunted in his eyes, a sadness that seemed too deep for a child. In 1996, 3 years after his mother's disappearance, Jevon began having nightmares. He would wake screaming in the middle of the night, his father rushing to his room to calm him. The boy couldn't or wouldn't say what the dreams were about, just shook his head and cried. He started drawing pictures, as children do, but the images were disturbing. Dark figures, a woman lying still on the ground, red marks that might have been blood. A teacher at the library where he attended reading programs noticed the drawings, mentioned them to a supervisor, but nothing came of it. They were just drawings, after all, the products of a traumatized child's imagination. No one thought to connect them to anything real. For those who have ever doubted someone you love, who have felt the slow erosion of trust, the weight of unspoken suspicions, you might understand what it was like for the few people who remained in contact with Diazien Hossencofft during those years. Friends who had known him before Girly disappeared began to distance themselves. Some said it was his behavior, the way he seemed to relish the mystery of his ex-wife's fate, the way he hinted at knowing more than he would say. Others simply couldn't reconcile the strange, grandiose man they knew with the possibility that he had done something terrible. It's easier, sometimes, to step away than to confront the darkness in someone you once trusted. In 1997, Hossencofft remarried. Her name was Linda Henning, a woman he had met online, someone drawn into his world of conspiracy theories and grand claims. They married quickly, moved together into the house where Jevon lived, created a strange approximation of a family. Linda would later say that she believed Diazien's stories at first, that he was a geneticist, that he was working on breakthrough research, that the government was watching him because his work was too important to be left unmonitored. She wanted to believe him because believing made her feel special, chosen, part of something larger than herself. But cracks began to show almost immediately. Diazien was controlling. He monitored her phone calls. He told her what to wear, what to eat, who she could talk to. And there was the matter of money, always money, strange transactions, accounts she wasn't allowed to access, questions she learned not to ask. The marriage lasted 2 years. In 1999, Linda Henning left Diazien Hossencofft and filed for divorce. During the proceedings, something happened that would change everything. Jevon, now 15 years old, was required to meet with a court-appointed counselor as part of the custody evaluation. The counselor, a woman named Dr. Patricia Reeves, had worked with traumatized adolescents for 20 years. She knew how to listen, how to create a space where truth could emerge. In their third session together, sitting in her office on a warm September afternoon, Jevon began to talk about his mother. He said he remembered more than he had told the police 6 years earlier. He said he had woken up that night in February 1993, had heard voices, had gotten out of bed and walked down the hallway toward the living room. He said he saw his father there, and a woman he didn't recognize, and his mother on the floor. He said his mother wasn't moving. He said there was something red on the carpet. He said his father saw him watching and told him to go back to bed, told him it was just a bad dream, told him never to speak of it. He said he was scared, so he obeyed. He went back to his room and pulled the covers over his head and tried to make himself believe it wasn't real. Dr. Reeves documented everything. She contacted the Albuquerque Police Department immediately. The case file, dormant for 6 years, was pulled from storage. Detective Martinez, now a lieutenant, was still with the department. He read the counselor's report twice, felt the old certainty flooding back, the knowledge that had sustained him through years of closed doors and dead ends. This was it. This was the break they needed. But prosecuting a murder without a body is complicated, fraught with legal challenges. The district attorney's office was cautious. They needed more than a teenager's recovered memory. They needed evidence. They needed corroboration. The investigation reopened officially on October 12, 1999. A new team of detectives re-interviewed everyone connected to the original case. They searched Diazine Hossencofft's house with a warrant, pulled up floorboards, dug in the backyard, used luminol to test for blood traces. They found nothing definitive. The house had been cleaned too well, too many years had passed, but they found other things. Financial records showing that Hossencofft had taken out a life insurance policy on Girly 2 weeks before she disappeared. Emails between Hossencofft and Linda Henning dating back to early 1993, months before they claimed to have met, discussing plans to eliminate obstacles in cryptic language. A storage unit rented under a false name, containing Girly's clothing, her jewelry, items that should have been in her apartment the night she disappeared. On December 3, 1999, Diazine Hossencofft was arrested at his home and charged with the murder of Girly Hossencofft. The arrest made front-page news in Albuquerque, reopened old wounds, shocked those who had begun to forget. Hossencofft maintained his innocence, claimed he was being framed by government agents who wanted to silence his research. But the evidence continued to accumulate. Linda Henning, facing charges as an accessory, agreed to cooperate with prosecutors. She told them that Diazine had confessed to her, had described killing Girly in the apartment that February night, had made her help him dispose of the body in the desert east of the city. She led investigators to a remote location near the Manzano Mountains, a desolate stretch of scrubland where nothing grew but creosote and cactus. They dug for 3 days. On the afternoon of the 3rd day they found her, or what was left of her. The desert had done its work, scavengers and weather and time, but the forensic team was able to confirm through dental records that the remains belonged to Girly Hossencofft. She had been stabbed multiple times. Her skull showed evidence of blunt force trauma. She had died quickly, the medical examiner said, which was small comfort to those who loved her. At least she hadn't suffered long. The trial began in September 2000. The courtroom was packed every day, spectators filling the benches, journalists scribbling notes, cameras outside catching everyone who entered or left. Diazine Hossencofft defended himself, having fired multiple lawyers, insisting that he alone could present his case. He spoke for hours, rambling testimonies about government conspiracies, alien DNA, secret projects. The judge allowed it within limits, though it was clear to everyone watching that Hossencofft's strategy was to overwhelm the jury with confusion rather than to prove his innocence. The prosecution presented a methodical case. The life insurance policy, the emails, Linda Henning's testimony, the storage unit, Jevon's account, now expanded and clarified through months of therapy and investigation. Jevon testified on the 8th day of the trial. He was 16 years old, tall and thin, with his mother's dark hair and quiet manner. He sat in the witness box and told his story in a steady voice, looking directly at his father as he spoke. He described waking up that night. He described what he saw. He described his father telling him to go back to bed. He described years of nightmares and fear and carrying the weight of a secret too terrible for a child to hold. The courtroom was silent. Some of the jurors wiped tears from their eyes. Diazine Hossencofft sat at the defense table, expressionless, taking notes on a yellow legal pad, acting as if his son were talking about someone else. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. They returned a verdict of guilty on all counts: first-degree murder, tampering with evidence, insurance fraud. Diazine Hossencofft was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Linda Henning, in exchange for her testimony, received a reduced sentence of 12 years for being an accessory after the fact. The judge, reading the sentence, looked directly at Hossencofft and said something that stayed with everyone in the courtroom that day. He said, "You took a mother from her child. You forced that child to live with the knowledge of what you did. You thought you were clever enough to get away with it, but the truth has a way of surviving, even when buried in the desert. Justice may be delayed, but it is not denied." The community that had watched and waited for 7 years felt something release, a collective exhaling. There were those who had always believed Hossencofft was guilty, who had whispered their suspicions at grocery stores and gas stations, who felt vindicated now. There were others who had defended him, who had been taken in by his charm and his stories, who now had to reckon with their misjudgment. But mostly there was sadness. Sadness for Girly, who had come to America seeking a better life and had found only violence. Sadness for Jevon, who would carry the trauma of that February night for the rest of his life. Sadness for all the years lost, the questions unanswered, the grief left unresolved while the machinery of justice slowly, painfully, ground toward truth. Clear's throat. Girly Hossencofft was buried in a small cemetery on the south side of Albuquerque, under a cottonwood tree that drops golden leaves every autumn. Her grave marker is simple, bearing her name and dates and a single line: "Beloved Mother." Jevon visits sometimes, those who know him say, standing by the grave in silence, speaking words only he and his mother can hear. He graduated high school, went to college, built a life separate from the horror that defined his childhood. He doesn't speak publicly about the case. He has earned his privacy, his right to move forward without being forever defined as the boy who testified against his father. The case of Girly Hossencofft became a cautionary tale in New Mexico and beyond, studied in criminal justice courses, discussed in true crime forums, referenced whenever people talk about cases where children witness terrible things and carry those secrets until they can finally, safely speak. It showed the importance of listening to children, of creating spaces where truth can emerge even years after the fact. It showed that justice, however delayed, can still prevail. It showed that even the most careful criminals leave traces, that the web of lies they spin eventually tangles them in its threads. For those who investigate such cases, who spend years chasing shadows and building circumstantial evidence brick by brick, the Hossencofft case stands as both a warning and an encouragement. A warning that some people are capable of profound evil, that they can look you in the eye and lie without flinching, that they can construct elaborate facades to hide the darkness within. And an encouragement that persistence matters, that the work of seeking truth is never wasted, that somewhere, someone is waiting for justice, even if they wait in silence. If this story mattered to you, subscribe and hit the bell. Share the episode. Someone somewhere may still be waiting to be heard.